Today, we're going to be talking about how to use tools from a business designer's toolkit to tackle business challenges of all sorts and sizes. And to have that conversation, we're going to be workshopping it. We're going to be workshopping business challenges live with three of our listeners who have volunteered to join us for the conversation. Becca, who I'll share a bit more in just a moment, will demonstrate live how a business designer thinks about tackling real life business challenges, from bringing new products to market, to making pitches more investable, to exploring opportunities to ensure long-term sustainability. So Becca, you're not going to solve every one of these challenges, but you are going to live talk through and demonstrate how you think, and you're going to equip us all with some tools that we can all start to use and apply in some of our own business challenges. I'm super excited. Are you ready for this, Becca?
I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
Okay. Before we get started, a quick introduction to IDEO. For those of you who may be tuning in live for the first time, our Creative Confidence podcast is from IDEO. We are an online school, and we help leaders creatively lead through any challenge. We teach you how to use design strategies, how to develop products and services that are rooted in unmet human needs, and we give you the skills to guide collaborative teams. You're going to get a taste of that today with Becca. So I have a warm-up question for everyone joining live. We have a wonderful global audience today. So I'm curious for all of you joining, what's a business challenge that you're facing right now at work, or a question you have about business design? And Becca, I'm going to let you take a look at what people are sharing. While she's doing that, Becca is an executive business designer, business design director at IDEO. She has built collaborative research labs focused on edge technologies like blockchain and artificial intelligence. She leads Last Mile Money, which is an innovation collective funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which focuses on advancing financial services to underserved and underbanked people worldwide. Additionally, and you're going to see this all today, she has advised numerous companies from Fortune 500 corporations to early stage startups on fintech trends, product market fit, and go-to-market planning. Becca, we're so excited for you to share your expertise with us today.
I am
So,
so excited to be here. I'm excited to learn from all of you. I mean, even just reading these things that are coming through the chat, things like, okay, what are we doing to incentivize innovation? How are we getting more clients in the door? I know all of us are facing some amount of revenue contraction in some form or fashion. Things like, how do we set priorities? How do we deliver more product level thinking? Oh, I can't wait for this conversation.
love it. And yep, this is clearly the right audience for it. So before we introduce our volunteers, Becca, what's one thing that you've been thinking about when it comes to business design these days? And for those who may be unfamiliar with this discipline of business design, what is it?
Oh, two very good questions. Maybe I'll start with your second one first, because I think that probably sets the right context. And as much as we try to sort of brand business design, I still think we are most familiar with it in contexts like IDEO or the design world. But business design, it really focuses on the viability side of the sort of triad of desirability, feasibility, and viability. And it's everything in between. I have a really good idea, and this thing is in market. So it blends product management, customer empathy, experience design to say, hey, have we created a harmonious system around the ways that we create value, deliver value, capture value? So you might see business designers leaning in on particular products where they're doing something like deeply understanding the core business or the competition and the competitive map that it sits within, thinking about things like, what are we designing that help us prototype things like revenue models or delivery models or service models, thinking about what are the core risks that this business might face and how are we mitigating them, thinking about, okay, how are we going to differentiate when something is in market and maybe there are a lot of other similar things in market, and of course creating the financial case, business model case to support investment. So that's kind of like broad strokes what business design is. And then a little bit about what I'm thinking about. I think business design is at such an interesting inflection point. I think for a very long time at IDEO, we've always been very prototyping forward. We've always believed that everything can be prototyped, right? It's not just the front end of a product or service, although you can prototype that, it's every part of the business. But when it comes to business design, sometimes that prototyping gets a little complex to execute, right? You're thinking about, okay, I've got a couple of different revenue models I want to try. I have a couple of different service delivery models I want to try. And sometimes it takes quite a lot of resources to stand up effective prototypes that help us get at people's behaviors. I think it's incredibly interesting to think about AI right now and how that might change our ability to prototype every element of the business, how it might change our ability to open up like myriad more ideas that are prototypable instead of having like pretty early on to zero into, okay, we got to make some calls. We're only able to prototype 3 of these. Let's just go with those. So I'm super curious about that. I think we're at a really interesting moment.
Amazing. Becca, and like one of our listeners says too, and part of this craft is how to stay open-minded and avoid solution attachment too soon. So prototyping. Okay, that was a lot. That was a lot of big ideas. Let's get really tangible, shall we?
Let's do it.
Let's
I'm
let's
ready.
dig into some stories. Okay, I want to welcome our first volunteer, Ashlyn Frank. And with Ashlyn, we're going to explore the business challenge of how do you build proof points for early ideas. Welcome, Ashlyn.
Hello.
Hello. So let me give context for Ashlyn and his business challenge, and then I'm going to hand it over to Becca and Ashlyn to talk through it. Ashlyn is a product design lead at JP Morgan, where he works to develop business by developing products and services that blend everything we've talked about, user-centered design and business thinking. However, we're going to go back in time a bit. While Ashlyn was in university, he started incubating an idea for a really great startup, which is going to be the focus of our talk. So we're sharing some info on screen, but I'm just going to read it too. So for those of you listening only, you know where we're at. So Ashlyn's startup idea is called Shelter Share. It's a home sharing platform that connects elderly homeowners who have extra space in their homes with younger people in need of affordable housing. In exchange for the subsidized rent, the younger housemates provide essential services such as grocery shopping, dog walking, snow shoveling, and tech support. This arrangement benefits the elderly homeowners by offering both income and assistance while providing the younger housemates with affordable living options. And so while Ashlyn has received positive feedback, he still faces the challenges regarding, Becca, what you said at the beginning, viability of the business, particularly when it comes to ensuring safety, trust, and matchmaking between the homeowner and home renter. So the question we want to explore is, how might we build proof points and validate the viability of our idea? With that, I'm going to hand it over to Becca and Ashlyn. And Becca, maybe you can dig in for a bit more context from Ashlyn.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ashlyn, I think the first context I want to hear is your co's overview of your challenge, and I would love to hear anything that you think that overview missed, anything that you're like, it's really important to understand this about Shelter Share.
Yeah, I think it's also the side from the elder homeowners where it's becoming hard for them. The house they're keeping up with their house is becoming a financial liability for them. Loneliness is something that's intangible and difficult to explain to people, but that's also a factor. And yeah, I think that's mostly what it is. Because on the other side, when we speak about young adults and them having affordable housing problem, I think that's pretty clear.
Got it.
Yeah.
So, I'm hearing like it's a two-sided marketplace challenge. In any two-sided marketplace, you're trying to dive into like, okay, which side has the bigger problem? How do we pull them into the platform? But I'm curious a little bit more about like you're flagging like we have some challenges related to viability. So I'm curious a little bit about sort of the design of the business as it stands today. And then what specific challenges are you having around viability? What part of it is your hunch like this is not quite viable yet?
So I see that trust, security, and matchmaking is something that we think is a value proposition here. Because if you look at any other home sharing platforms, there are smaller things like flexible housing agreements and stuff like that that probably ShelterShare can offer. But when it comes to trust, matchmaking, and yeah, I guess safety, how do we try to make sure that that is accounted for or people feel safe to stay in someone else's house? We did There was another exploration which we did was, what if we, instead of having this as a business to consumer marketplace, what if we have a third person in between, like organizations
Mhm.
whose mission or yeah, whose mission is to help the senior population? Will that kind of help break that, and does that facilitate better background checks or any of that? that relates to trust and safety.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And I know you mentioned when we were chatting before that you have a couple of slides that you think articulate the shelter share opportunity. Do you want to pull those up now? I think it might be useful for the audience to get a little context.
Yeah, I could do that quick. Sure. Okay. I don't see a possibility. Oh yeah, I do see it. Yes. Can you all see my screen, which says
We can see it.
So, just in general, I mean, I want us to take a moment and think of our homes right now and all the countless memories attached to it. So, where we live is a huge indicator of our quality of life and our identity. So, it's not so surprising that more than 90% of the people above the age of 65 want to live in their homes and neighborhoods for as long as possible. But this becomes less and less achievable, like I spoke about. They need to be taken care of. Houses are becoming financial liabilities, and they face crisis of loneliness. This is the two sides that I was talking about. On one side, we have 5 million idle bedrooms in baby boomers' houses. And on the other side, we have 209,000 youngsters who cannot afford rents. Another interesting fact that we saw was that I didn't mention this before, but 40% of the people said that they always wanted to rent out, but only 2% were actually doing it. So we thought that's what Shelter Share can fix. So to just, talk about it again, it's a home sharing platform that connects elderly home owners who are willing to rent out a portion of their homes with young adults who are willing to offer an helping hand in their day-to-day in return for subsidized rent. We did look at a business model because this always comes up as something very altruistic. So we were trying to tackle the viability part of it. So we saw that the total potential users are 209,000 young people who don't have rents. And if we think of it as some place like Pittsburgh, where the average rent might be 1,000 per room, and then if they can basically reduce their rents by 20% in exchange for just 2 hours of assistance. And elderly homeowners can earn up to 800 per month for previously just empty rooms in their homes, right? And if we take a transaction of 10% fee from owners, then it's close to 960 per young adult per year. Now, this is the total market. Of course, not everybody's going to buy for it. So that's how I see that there is a potential for the viability, but it's not pretty solid. And I think that safety and trust is a big concern.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And thanks for sharing those slides. I think that's really useful context. One of the things I often think about when I hear a venture talking about we need to build out proof points is, I mean, by definition, when you're talking about a new venture, you're talking about something that is unproven, right? You need to build out proof points for literally every element of the business. And I assume that as you were sort of developing Shelter Share, developing the opportunity, you were sort of taking it out to potential investors, partners, people who were raising like, well, this is the part that feels most unclear to me. So a tool I often use to kind of get at, okay, which of these parts do I need to prove out is something that at IDEO we call a business story. Sometimes we call it a venture story. It's kind of a Mad Lib type tool.
And sorry to interrupt, Becca. As we're gonna get that on screen. Ashlyn, do you mind stop sharing and we'll get ready to share the tool that you're about to go ahead. Continue on. Sorry.
No worries. So for me, I think this Mad Lib type tool is interesting in any new venture because it's kind of hits on some of the critical elements that you have to get right for your venture to be investable, right? For if you're a VC or whoever to say, hey, for this early stage idea, I could hit that 100x return that I need to from a power law perspective. And so sometimes it's useful to use a venture story like that to zero in on like, okay, where are the places that I feel really confident that I'm completely right? And where are the places in this Mad Lib that I'm like, I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure people are going to do that. I'm not quite sure the market size is that big. And so I don't know, Ko, if you're able to pull it up on the screen, but I'm wondering if you kind of took this Mad Lib approach, Ashlyn, and kind of walked me through like, what are your answers to these questions? If we could use that as a way to zero in on some of the trust and safety challenges that you're surfacing as like are like from your perspective the most important ones.
And I'm just going to read aloud for those listening. So when we say Mad Lib, it's a very American-centric word. It's a narrative story where we're filling in the blanks. So we are the business. We are going to vision for our business, the problem we're solving for whom? Our customers. Our customers will choose our blank offer because of value proposition. We will get paid how much, how often, by whom. To fulfill that value proposition, our most important costs include blank, and people can find our offer at, or in here's channels, during, when. And so,
And actually,
Ashley,
code to short circuit it. And Ashlyn, if you're okay with me synthesizing a little bit from what you shared, I'm like, okay, I get a lot of this, right? We're shelter share. We're going to solve the affordable housing and loan crisis among young people and loneliness crisis among older people for college students and elderly adults in the US, I presume, at least at first. We think that they're going to choose our shared housing solution because it is the safest, most trustworthy way. Like that's my hunch of why you're like, this is the part we have to get right, is we think that's going to be the major barrier to adoption. And then you sort of talk through like, hey, we did a little bit of a bottom-up market sizing. We think we're going to get paid on commission of people we place, and they're going to discover us. We didn't really talk about distribution, but like maybe through colleges. And so, all right, then it's like helpful for me because then you can zero in on like, okay, we think people are going to choose us because we are the safest platform to do this. And so I'm curious, Ashlyn, if you can unpack a little bit, what are the elements of safety that you are trying to get right? And what are the things that you've experimented with or prototyped that help you understand, like, here are ways that we can deliver that safety?
Yeah, I don't think we actually prototyped for safety. It's a bit hard to think of it, or I couldn't come up with anything like prototypes, but we did speak to customers. And I mean, there was a lot of reading between the lines that I could see that a lot of people had done it in the past too, but they wouldn't say that they wanted to do it. And I thought that it was more about compatibility for some reason,
Hmm.
because trust the people who I saw who had this kind of an agreement, they came through some kind of a word of mouth. So they were okay with the trust. But compatibility was an concern. So in our prototypes that we initially had done back in school, we had thought of having a very detailed list of parameters to match. But then now we have, I don't want to just use the word AI for this, but it is I think, the backbone of all matchmaking services, right, currently. So I do see that instead of just thinking of parameters, what if we just gather qualitative feedback from them, or just ask them, explain what they expect, and do the matchmaking based on that quality or sentiment rather than parameters that you click in just general apps these days.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm so reminded, and I'm sure you've heard this story so many times, but I'm so reminded of Airbnb's early days, right? Where at first it sounds really absurd to say, hey, there's a stranger who's going to show up at your house for a conference and sleep in your guest bedroom. And one of their early unlocks was looking for signals of trust that they could embed into the platform, one of which was really high quality photographs, right? Airbnb early on hired professional photographers to visit every single home and take photographs that made the home feel closer to a hotel-like experience, right? Closer to oh, wow, this is not someone's messy, unmade bed. And I have to trust that when I show up, they're not going to be scary or make me feel uncomfortable, but I'm going to feel really comfortable. So I think there's two things I'm hearing in kind of your thoughts around how we could prototype this. One is we could take a prototyping approach that is, we can do better matchmaking by leveraging new forms of signals from AI, from the social graph, wherever. That's great. Like you might be able to better match than any other platform. However, you still have to overcome this challenge of the user still has to trust that you've done this. And so what are the signals that they're going to be looking to be able to trust that your matchmaking is actually correctly putting the right people in their homes? And so then I would think a little bit about what are the different vectors or variables you might have to play with to signal that trust. And so I'm hearing a bunch of really awesome ideas that I think are actually pretty prototypable in the comments, where you might be saying things like, okay, maybe we have trusted partnerships. Maybe our distribution strategy is anchored in universities, right? And we've got the local university kind of seal of approval. So you feel like, okay, if something went really wrong, I know where this person goes to school. I know they came through this university. I feel like maybe there's recourse. You could think about more sort of front end ways to develop that trust, like thinking about things like reviews of prior tenants or reviews of, like kind of the Airbnb host guest review model. You could think about things like photographs. You could think about things like badges that people are earning when they're providing things like verification of their identity and things like that. There's a bunch of different like things I could imagine you experimenting with. And then I think for a new venture, it's like, okay, how do you pull those down into prototypable scale? So then that would make me wonder something like, could you execute a partnership just with your university? And maybe you've got 4 or 5 different indicators of trust that you want to like sort of, you've got strong hunches around, and you want to actually try those out with maybe 4 different groups of students that you're trying to place into housing. And like, I think when you're running a pilot like that, you're getting like not just what people are saying kind of data, but you're getting, oh, actually, we showed 40 profiles to 10 homeowners, and the ones that had the shelter share badge of approval, those are the ones that got picked every single time. Okay, that's a good signal that we need to design out this badge of approval. We think that's an important trust signal to adoption.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
sorry.
Ashlyn, yeah, please, would love to hear your reflections, and then we're going to start to wrap up. I know it's far too fast, but what does it make you think?
No, that this is very interesting because I did think of them at very 2 different points. One is the matchmaking was more of a recent thought with AI, but I had gotten feedback about having another organization to basically vet for this. So yeah, I think I could try prototyping a way that even just in the platform, it feels a more secure, that it is that the background process is kind of seen and visible and believable, I guess.
Yeah, like bringing forward some of that, even if at first you're doing that entirely manually, sometimes at IDEO we call that Wizard of Oz prototyping, right? But it's like you can sort of test out a version where it seems like, wow, I'm using the most sophisticated customer algorithm to do matchmaking, when in prototype form it might be your team, right? Manually doing matchmaking and something you intend to digitize in the future. But it can get you to that answer of, okay, what are the signals users are looking to, which can then get you to what I imagine the investor response is, which is, we think you will have a problem with trust and adoption, and that's why we're concerned that this business will not grow. And you have this like wonderful counter then to say, well, I've actually run 3 or 4 different tests of ways to signal trust. I found that X, Y, and Z work really well. So look at the ways that I'm building that into the core of the platform going forward.
Okay, awesome.
Amazing. So I know we could keep talking. Ashlyn, there is so much, I don't know if you've seen the chat, but there's so much support for your idea, and I hope you've gotten some great ideas for where you might take it next. Becca, any last things to summarize? So we went deep in like kind of the one area, like Ashlyn, you mentioned trust and compatibility was the tool also could help you surface other areas where you are feeling the most kind of risk or the most unknowns.
Yeah, that's what I often like to use venture stories to do. And Ashlyn, you were pretty much already there. You were like, I know this challenge. But a lot of times with new ventures, it's like, let's use that to basically like, sometimes I'll go through and rank each part of the venture story and say, what is my level of confidence? Because so much of early stage ventures, right, is about building increased confidence. It's not about any one of those things being entirely right. It's, where are you confident that you're at least going in the right direction? And where are you not as confident? Because in an early stage venture, you're prioritizing. You cannot prove out every element of the business from day one. And so what are the most important assumptions you're making that have to be right to work? And then it's taking that tool and saying like, okay, now what might I prototype? What might I actually create, put into market? Again, try to understand behavior, try to translate my insights into action. So Ashlyn, this was awesome. I'm rooting for Shelter Share. I hope you pick it back up. It sounds like a really cool opportunity.
This is super helpful. Thank you so much, Becca.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Ashlyn.
Thank you, Ashlyn. So to recap, we've been talking about the story tool, the business story tool, and what it is. It's an essential way for landing the key pieces of what is required for a viable and valuable business. It helps you cut through the noise and summarize how you can create value, and also how you can figure out where you might need to develop more prototypes in order to build that confidence. Okay, let's move on to our next guest. And Becca, you mentioned a lot about prototyping. I think this next guest is great. We're going to get even more tangible about what that means to how might we prototype. So let's bring our next volunteer, Maria Camino. And with Maria, we're going to explore the challenge of building confidence in a go-to-market strategy. Welcome, Maria.
Hi.
Hi. I might give a bit of background about Maria, and then I'll hand it back over. So Maria is the founder of Salsa Growth Partners, a consulting firm focused on health and wellness innovation in Latin America. She has a background in design and engineering from Stanford University, and over the past decade has led over 50 transformation projects across Latin America in various industries from healthcare to consumer goods, mining, and finance. So Maria's specific challenge today, she is doing a project for Roy Laboratoria, and Maria, I will welcome you to say it even better than I will. Well, they are a leading clinical lab in Lima, Peru, and known for quality results and legendary customer service. Roy is looking to bring home testing kits to the Peruvian market, a trend that has gained momentum. Currently, home testing in Peru is limited to only a few categories: pregnancy and COVID-19 tests. They want to expand the market by bringing tests for UTIs, drugs, pregnancy, and ovulation. Amazing, amazing purpose and vision. The challenge is figuring out the next steps for market entry. They've considered various criteria from market demand, manufacturing constraints, desirability. They have a lot of information that points which tests they should bring to market, but not entirely confident about the choice or the sequence. They are also looking at ways they have to make choices around channel and brand. So the question that Becca and Maria are going to explore, are how might we build confidence in our go-to-market strategy and prioritize those next steps? Juicy space. Becca, I'm going to hand it over to you and Maria.
Amazing. Maria, this is so cool. What an interesting market making opportunity. I'm curious a little bit. You sort of talked about, hey, you guys have considered what are the right tests to run? What are the right channels? Tell me a little bit more about this challenge or this opportunity, and then what criteria you've been using to narrow in on here's what our first product should look like.
Sure. Can I share a couple slides?
Yeah, that would be great.
Perfect. All right. So 2 key facts to talk about before going into that are, first, that most people in Peru who get sick don't get to go to the doctor. And the second one is that pharmacies don't have aisles where people can walk around like in the States. So having that in mind for the challenge, we want to capture this unserved market and get to especially rural areas by creating this at-home rapid test business unit.
Maria, I'm not, do you want to, oh, sorry, never mind.
All right. Okay, so to answer your question, what we've looked at so far to narrow down our test shortlist is our first sales records of similar businesses in the Latin America region. We've done some user research interviews. We've benchmarked in Europe, in the States, looking at Walgreens aisles, CVS aisles. We have our own patient testing data, but we really didn't feel like we had the right approach. So right now, our best shot has been looking at feasibility, so tests that are FDA approved, and we're matching that with asking ourselves, and based on the user research that we've done, what problem are we solving for our user? And that's how we've narrowed it down to 4 main testing options, which would be for UTIs, multi-drug tests, pregnancy and ovulation, and HIV, obviously all for different kinds of users. But that's what we've got so far.
That's awesome. So I'm seeing in this, you're certainly using like some amount of competitive mapping, right? Okay, we've got similar businesses, or we can, go to CVS in the States and say, hey, here are the tests that are available. We're using some qualitative research insights to understand which of these tests are going to be important. And then we're using some amount of feasibility compliance. Like, you can't offer something that might take, $1 billion to develop and is not approved anywhere. And sure, it'd be great to have a money tree in my backyard that grows money, but it's not feasible to create. So I want to actually dig in a little bit to your point of, so we did that, but then we weren't really confident in what the answer was. So tell me a little bit about why you weren't confident, or what kinds of thresholds you were looking to, or you have a hunch would create confidence for you.
That's a great question. It's just there's so many options about going at this problem that really That's a really good question that I hadn't thought the answer to before. But yeah, I just feel like there's so many options that so many combinations of pieces of information that we could take, that this is what's making sense to us right now. But there's not a method that says, okay, this is the right one, this is the wrong one, and we're on the right track.
Oh my gosh, I feel it. I think it actually relates to Ashlyn's like venture story thing too. It's like, okay, when you're creating something new, in your case, Maria, like creating a new market, right? Like it's not like you're saying, hey, we're gonna launch another COVID test. There's 50 COVID tests and we need packaging design to stand out or whatever. It's like nobody's doing these tests right now. So when we make this large investment, roll out the new product, it has to be because we believe that we're going to be able to make sales commensurate. We are actually going to be able to make that market. And so I find a lot of times then, because you're sort of talking about the permutations and combinations, it can be really useful to think about, well, what are the actual experiments that we might run that might actually get us to early and then even later signals of actual behavior, actual buying behavior, actual usage behavior, actual sending in behavior, cost, all of that. And so like one of the things I'm thinking about or I'm hearing as you're saying, it's like, okay, there's a bunch of different variables you're looking at. It's what tests do we offer? It's probably like, where do we offer them, right? Like, do we have a kiosk? Do we set up our own like storefronts? Is it all online and people have to discover it that way? It's presumably some constraints around like within those tests, how do we actually give them to the customers and get them back? Because if I'm understanding right, some of them you're sending back, it's not just all in one, or are they all like kind of all in one? You take the test and you can do it all yourself.
For now, it's self-sampling and
Okay,
self-testing. So we're starting with that because that would add more complexity.
Okay.
But yeah.
Great. I'm glad I just removed a variable. So like, I think as you're thinking about those permutations and combinations, one of the things I would do is like literally like, and you probably have this laid out in a graph somewhere, but look at your 4 or 5 different prioritized tests and the 3 to 4 different channels that you might go after and pull out what are some of the specific hunches you have that these ones are going to be the lowest lift to stand up and the highest likelihood of adoption. That part is going to be an assumption, right? So that's what I would sort of start with is pull that out and start to articulate, like, I have this assumption that if we could offer, home UTI tests, and if those were in kiosks at the supermarket, we would achieve XYZ penetration. But the next thing I would do is actually say like, okay, cool, that's an assumption. Let's actually turn that assumption into a prototype. So, Ko, I think you're going to pull this up. Sometimes we use a worksheet to do this. It's not rocket science, but it can be helpful to sort of clarify thinking. So effectively, it's an experiment design worksheet. So it says, hey, you're going to surface an assumption that's critical if this thing is going to work. So in this case, it might be, oh, I'm willing to buy a home UTI test at the grocery store, right? That we say that, I don't know what the percentage is and what the right benchmarks are for your specific context, but we say that 3% of people visiting the grocery store in a given week are going to be candidates for a home UTI test, and they're actually going to pick it up and buy it. You then turn that assumption into a question that you might be able to prototype against, right? Which is like, well, okay, what would need to exist for people to pick up home UTI tests at the supermarket? And then you might say like, okay, great. What I might do is actually build out a minimum viable prototype to answer that question. So in your case, it might be, I'm going to set up, I'm not going to build the vending machine. That's not minimum viable. But I might set up, I might negotiate with a local supermarket, set up a stand, and actually set some benchmarks for, I want to see this level of throughput. That's what my, business model suggests should be viable. Let's put that stand in a local supermarket and see if we're seeing that throughput. And you can obviously scale this up and up and up. But as you were talking, Maria, I was reminded so much of PillPack. If anyone's not familiar with PillPack is a mail order pharmacy. They were bought by Amazon a few years back. When they started, they're actually, we got to work really closely with them, and they had lots of really analogous questions, even down to things like, well, what should the pricing be? Should it be $19 a month, $29 a month, $39 a month? And literally the way they prototyped it was they went to a local mall, set up a kiosk, and had a brochure with $19 that they offered on Friday, a brochure with $29 that they offered on Saturday, a brochure with $39 that they offered on Sunday. And this gave them again, more directional confidence that the answer is right. So I'm curious hearing all that, like if you were to sort of take that and come back into, okay, now we've got these different permutations. What are some of the experiments that are coming to mind for you? What are the things that you might run?
Oh, definitely something along the lines of what you're suggesting. In terms of channels, supermarkets, train stations, like thinking about, since the main attributes are privacy and access, not thinking about the traditional places where you would buy a test, but thinking more of, okay, where would be a very private place where someone could buy an HIV test without feeling anything. So in terms of channels, yeah, I would try to think as wide as possible. And I still feel like I need a box to prototype that actual buying of the test. This is that kind of thing where you can't really prototype an idea. Like, imagine this. It's just like, are you picking up the box or are you
No,
not?
I actually think that's literally like in some ways what I would do. Even if like, and this is like a little bit tricky. Of course, you have like compliance constraints you have to run through. Of course, you have to get supermarkets or whoever to agree to let you run the small scale prototype. But depending how small scale it is, that may be easy or hard. And you could think about creating comparison points, right? Where in some places you might have a box and the test, which I'm assuming is mostly already developed or close to developed enough that someone might get, or you might even just be assessing demand, right? Where then you just have maybe a box, but maybe the box contains a coupon to go to your local lab because we haven't actually developed the end-to-end test kit. You could even compare those channels with one another if you wanted to run multiple simultaneous experiments, right? You could say, okay, we're going to do one of these in a supermarket. We're going to do one of these at like a local kiosk that's branded health tests. We're going to do one of these purely online, and we're going to do one of these through a partner. And we actually think like comparing all of those in real time is going to give us confidence on like what is the right channel. And I would think about like, again, going back to that grid of the different permutations and combinations, which ones do you feel most strongly about is like, you're probably going to have to make some choices about which ones you test, right? You probably cannot run a test for every permutation and combination out there. So I think that's where that prioritization matrix comes in of, okay, within that, like, do we think that that's actually feasible? Even if it tests the best, do we think it's feasible to go deliver it? And do we think that it could drive the revenue we want to see out of this product?
And do you think we should keep our original, established, traditional brand, or should we
this is
evolve?
Such a good question, because I have seen, frankly, I've seen organizations do it both ways, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons that you might do it. So to your point, like Roy Laboratory, am I saying it right? Okay. Has this established brand. That's an asset, right? Like that's something that like not everybody has that's meaningful, but it may or may not serve to bolster the product depending on what the product is. So I've seen organizations where they're like, hey, we have this established brand, we're a bank, but people kind of associate us with like not necessarily great things. Like our brand equity is not that great. And so actually, if we want to roll out this product, we might want to do it under a sub-brand that doesn't carry the baggage of the existing brand. In your case, I'm seeing like, okay, there are specific things that you would want people to associate with the product, that it's private, that it's instant, it's accessible. Some of the things that you're seeing over there, to your point on Roy Laboratory, those aren't part of what you are sort of imagining the customer promise of these tests to be. So again, this is something else that I would test is I would actually have a couple of different boxes, one with new brand, and obviously you design out the brand to hopefully convey all these wonderful, adjectives on the screen. But I might like literally have a test that you run where you're like, all right, we've got some boxes that have our core brand and some boxes that have a new brand. Are we seeing a difference in uptake? And you may find like, no, brand awareness just isn't high enough. So it's not really making a difference. So we should just go with the one that is logistically most feasible to deliver. Or you may find like, wow, actually, everybody's going to the trusted brand because even though we've designed this brand to confer trust, it still feels like a startup. It still feels unknown. Or you may find like, actually, everyone's going to our new brand. So again, it's something that I would actually explicitly test as part of your live prototypes.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maria. This is such an interesting challenge.
Maria, thank you for coming on. This has been amazing. So to summarize and just to put a point on it too, what we've been talking about is ways to prototype, and it starts with surfacing an assumption, and then what we really focus on is actual behaviors. So I think at this stage in a business, people often think of very elaborate validation type tests. And Becca, what you're guiding us to think about is how to design that minimum viable test or experiment that gets to actual behaviors.
Yeah, I would get it at like design the minimum viable test, because for a new venture, you're getting the minimum viable confidence. Like Maria, you're signaling like you're not quite there, but that's what you want, right? You want enough confidence to say, I'm going to run down the runway for the next step, whatever the next step in this new product is, because you're never going to have a guaranteed, I have solved every element and I know for sure it's going to work. It's always going to be a risk. So it's about figuring out what is the minimum level of confidence I need to actually go out and take this risk.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Maria,
Maria.
thank you. And so this has been wonderful, Becca. We have one more, and I want to
Amazing.
dig into it because, again, and now we're going to go into a little bit of a different path of just thinking about additional ways to expand an offer. So let's bring our next volunteer, and he's already here. Hi, Ben. Welcome,
Good.
Ben. So we're going to explore with Ben the challenge of demystifying offers and revenue paths. I'm going to do the same intro. Ben is a partner and co-founder at Whole School Mindfulness, which is a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to building a more mindful education system. So let me tell you a little bit more. So Whole School Mindfulness. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to go slow to say all this well. For the past 5 years, they've supported schools in launching and supporting mindfulness director positions across the country. And you've been providing seed funding to the schools and professional development to support that role of these mindfulness directors. So the challenge with this is, so while the model has been successful, it's showing impactful progress in its programming, the cost of launching new directors is high. And right now, they are 100% dependent on philanthropy for growth. So Ben and his team are interested in exploring opportunities to diversify revenue streams in order to increase the ability to make impact and build a more sustainable organization. So the core challenge we want to talk about is how might we think about crafting new offers and diversifying our revenue? Becca and Ben.
Very cool. Oh my gosh. Ben, this is such a cool initiative. Wait, okay. So tell me more. So the structure is that you place a mindfulness director in the school. Right now, you fund 100% of that director. Is that right?
So it's a little bit different than what you're describing.
Okay.
Actually, typically it's somebody who's already employed and working at a school. Here, so let's say it's an English teacher who loves mindfulness, has a practice, has already potentially identified that mindfulness would be helpful for their students and has been integrating it in some way kind of on the side. They hear about us and say, oh my gosh, this is the dream role I never knew could exist. And then they would apply to us with their school administration support. And if selected as a mindfulness director, we would provide some seed funding to the school to help kind of grease the wheels of bureaucracy and get a position carved out, either part or full time.
Got it.
Then with the mindfulness directors, we support them with professional development and community throughout the year.
Got it. And so in that context, if it's someone at the school, it's kind of an organic demand, at least from the usage side of, hey, I want to do this at my school, and I kind of make the case. When you're saying we sort of grease the wheels from bureaucracy, is that because the person actually needs to change their role pretty tremendously? Like they were an English teacher and now they have a new job, which is mindfulness director. Is that right?
Yeah, we see
Okay.
a few different things. Some schools are ready for whatever, lots of different kind of causes and conditions are ready to transition somebody's full-time role over to teaching mindfulness. We do see that. However, the majority of the time, it's not that clean cut. Perhaps they, in addition to their full-time role, they have a paid after-school role where they're doing mindfulness, or, you know, somebody takes over one of their classes and they're doing mindfulness during that block. That kind of, it's a little bit, we meet schools where they're at in terms of their.
So it's not a like plug and play product. It's a, hey, we meet you, kind of design something custom for the situation you find yourself in.
Correct.
And then, okay, tell me more about this challenge. So is this a conversion challenge that you fund them with philanthropic dollars, and then there's some point at which the dollars run out? And then there's just this question mark about like, what now?
We've tried a couple models there. Originally, we did a percentage-based model where year one, we would pay 100% of their salary. Year two, we pay 75%. Year three, 50. Year four, 25. And the idea is that the school, as they got to see the impact of the mindfulness programming, would take on more of the cost. And that was extremely expensive because, somebody who's in a school district who's been there working for a while might be making $100,000. So it could really, rack up our cost per school cost. So now we've pivoted to a model where it's a 2-year based funding model with a cap of $50,000 total. So $25K a year for 2 years. But what we're interested in exploring now is not every school is ready for that type of arrangement, even with the catalytic funding. And is there an opportunity for us to offer a different type of programming that we might even be able to earn some revenue off of that might, establish our name in the space, get more mindfulness into schools in a different way, and potentially build relationships that one day might lead to a mindfulness director model.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of making me think of, and I know, Ko, you have this tool at the ready, but it's kind of making me think of the jobs to be done framework, if you're familiar with that.
No.
It's a really useful framework, came from Clay Christensen several years back. Effectively, it's that we design product, services, systems, and we think like that's the whole of what the product or service does. But actually, like what the product or service does for the user is solve some kind of problem, do a particular job for them, right? And so I think it can sometimes be helpful, and in this context, I think it's useful to think about it this way, is to like, Ben, I'm curious to hear from you, like, what is the core job to be done, or the job that you hope that any product that Host School ever offers is going to do? And then you can start to think about it. This framework is kind of useful because it says like, okay, well, what are the different ways you've manifested that? Like currently you have this way, right? It's a 50% funded model for 2 years. But then I think the third thing that's really interesting, that kind of outer ring, is what are the jobs that stakeholders are doing in order to adopt your job? So in your case, I might imagine like, we've got a job to be done. It's about expanding the capability of schools to support mindfulness education. The structure we have right now is we fund teachers for 2 years to develop programming, create content, whatever. But the jobs that the school districts need to do are pretty myriad to adopt us, right? The teacher has to find us, someone has to find us. They have to write the proposal. They get funded for 2 years, but then they have to find funding somewhere. They've presumably got some sort of board approvals that they have to go to. And so I think this kind of framework can be useful as you're thinking about like, well, what are the other things we might experiment with to basically start to map out, okay, we've got this hunch. Maybe you have a hunch, I'm sure you have many, right? About like, maybe we could offer some sort of online courseware where people are, where any teacher could easily sign up for mindfulness training. Okay, great. Let's think about then, like, what are the different jobs to be done that they would need to go through to actually adopt that? And you could start to map out like, well, what would be really complex to get adopted? What would be really simple to get adopted? And then the second set of mapping you could do is like, well, what's feasible for us to actually deliver? So curious how that's landing with you. And also, did I get your job to be done, the core job to be done of Host School correct?
Yeah, I think you did. There are a lot of ways to get mindfulness into schools. They're the curricula, they're the train the trainer models, they're the apps, they're the outside service provider coming in, doing some mindfulness and then leaving. And what our perspective is that mindfulness done best in a school is really rooted in community. So it's somebody who's a trusted member of the community and they're into it and they have a dedicated role or some time to do it. And one thing that has come to mind that I'd be interested to see how it fits into this framework is, I think one of the biggest value adds is the learning community of mindfulness directors that we have going, and really just the mental model shift that can occur in those cohorts when people are in community supporting each other and have dedicated time to really think strategically, how can I integrate mindfulness into my school? Something happens that's separate from the money. It's really just like a mental model shift of the individuals. So I am curious about if we could do some kind of cohort-based model for people that aren't necessarily dedicated mindfulness directors, but have an interest in infusing mindfulness into their culture.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I see the note in the chat. I will check myself. I misstated. Jobs to be Done was popularized by Clay Christensen, but actually has a long history before Clay Christensen with a number of thinkers, including Tony Olick, popularizing it, coining it. But okay, so I'm hearing like a specific structure there, Ben, which is, all right, we have one structure that is the current funded model. We have another structure of how we could do that job, right, of equipping schools and teachers to expand mindfulness education, which is creating these cohort type models. And then I could think of like, okay, in order to adopt, then a bunch of other things need to be true, right? Then we need to say, okay, our existing, teachers might be willing to share best practices and what they've learned. New teachers might have, an extra 30 minutes in their week to absorb this content. Presumably there's some like cost associated with it potentially. So like, is that something that is within a teacher or a principal's discretionary budget, or is that something that they need to go find funding for? I kind of wonder if you were to sort of like populate, like what are all the different structures we have hunches around and almost plot them on a 2x2 and start to think about like, well, for whole school, what is the revenue impact, right, that we might see? Because you could develop something like amazing that you gave away for free and it doesn't really solve your core challenge of like, but how does that make us sustainable as an organization? But so what is the impact if this works? If we did it right, what would the impact be? And then also, how feasible is it for whole school to deliver it? Because there might be like really interesting and exciting opportunities to go after that are so far from the current structures you put in place that would be really expensive to stand it up, even if it is a very big economic opportunity. And that might help to sort of prioritize a little bit into like, what are the different streams of revenue we might want to go after? Where I could imagine like there's a totally different approach, right? Which is, hey, we actually think the current way is right, but we need to massively expand the amount of funders that come in because we know it's not going to be school district. So then it might be things like thinking about philanthropy, parent funding, like lots of different avenues that you might think about. But I might think a little bit in that kind of realm. And I'm curious, like you're raising cohort models as one alternative option, but I imagine there are a bunch of others that you're thinking about that could be new revenue streams for you.
Yeah, but one way we've thought about it is really changing our point of entry right now. Our typical entry is, a mindfulness director candidate. So an English teacher, a math teacher hears about us and they apply and they're lobbying typically their principal or assistant principal to work with them on the application. So it's a very much kind of a bottom-up approach. And what we've found is that that has its advantages for sure. But sometimes those people don't have really levers of power when it comes to budgetary decision making. So we've thought about changing our point of entry to district leadership. And there's also ways in which so districts have access to more money. It's a lot more competitive as a space because a lot of folks are going after district funding. So you have to be a little bit more sophisticated. You have to be data-backed, evidence-based, things that are relatively high bars to reach. But there's more money potential there if we could really find a way to meet district leadership needs.
What would have to change about the core product, or do you have hunches about what would have to change about the core product to meet district needs? I'm hearing like we would need to gather more data, but do you think like the way the product is delivered would need to change, or do you think like actually it could work exactly the same way, just from a different pot of money?
I think what would need to change partially is the kind of buy-in around mindfulness in the United States or to really scale. Like, and that's partially what we're going after, creating proof points. But aside from that, I think it wouldn't be that big of a pivot, but right now it's kind of one mindfulness director per school. And it could be one mindfulness director per district working across 8-10 schools, and that might make it more feasible.
Interesting. So you could think about it, if you went at the district level, you could think about it as like, okay, cool. This could be a shared service and it could be tapped by a school whenever they need it. I think there's also like that comment you're sort of saying like, oh, well, the overall environment, that's also something we think about a lot in business design, right? Is like, what are the macro trends that enable or get in the way of scaling, right? And how do we align the way that we're delivering our product to those macro trends, right? Where I might say like, yeah, okay, we are seeing mindfulness kind of like having a moment, but not necessarily at the school district level, but probably more likely among like parents, right? Thinking about like, okay, now like my office offers the Calm app as an employee benefit. So But like, that makes me think about like, okay, if the macro trend is being expressed in that way, how do you leverage that to actually increase support for homeschool, which doesn't mean like getting out of schools, but might like change like, okay, maybe our delivery model is actually about building persistent parent demand for mindfulness education in school. And so what might we create that has parents, showing up at their local school district saying like, hey, why aren't you teaching my kids this? I want them to see this. So like,
Yeah.
I think there's like a bunch of different avenues you could think about to sort of generate that demand. But I think including the sector level trends is actually a really useful forcing function to be like, okay, then what could we realistically go after? What could we realistically win?
Thank you.
So thank you. I'm going to start to wrap us up. Ben, thank you. Thank you. Becca, you covered a lot of territory with Ben. Can you just help summarize for Ben and I at least?
Yeah, for
the
sure.
kind of the big idea, like, so why talk about jobs be done as one of we often talk about using tools to build to think. It helps expand the ways in which we see problems. But then where would you?
Yeah, for sure. So
Where take
I
it
think
next?
about it as like, if you can get clear about your job to be done, you can kind of release yourself from the constraint of like, oh, this is how the product works.
Okay.
And a lot of times when you find that there's an existing product, like in whole school, that's in the market doing well, you can be pretty constrained of just like, well, that's how it works. So it has to work that way in the future. But if you can go zero in on what is the job to be done, then you can kind of expand your aperture to say, well, what are the different structures by which I might deliver this job? And then I do think it's a good forcing function to then say like, well, everyone around me who might use me to do this job has a BATNA, has an alternative to using me. They have another way of getting this job done. And so thinking about, well, what are the other ancillary jobs, ancillary activities they're going to have to do in order to adopt me? That can be a good forcing function to be like, okay, here's how we can prioritize. Because while it's not a math equation, it is a little bit of an equation, right? The work they have to do to adopt me has to be less than the benefit that they're getting by adopting me. And so it can be a good sort of forcing function to say like, well, which of these might we prioritize that we think are going to be viable in the market, because that equation is making sense. It's evening out.
Amazing. Thank you. Ben, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing, and best of luck.
Yeah, appreciate you
Thanks,
both.
Ben.
So Becca, we are going to start to wrap it up. I think we all agree who doesn't want your own podcast, like business design challenges with Becca? Like, you are amazing.
This is fun. Oh my goodness. I'm like, not with me necessarily, but I would listen to this like weird call-in show of like, here's my business problem.
You're amazing. And I want to thank all of our volunteers, Ashlyn, Maria, and Ben. Thank you for sharing your challenges and being open to workshopping live with us. And I hope all of you joining today get a sense of, so here's how we approach business design. So there's tools and mindsets that can both widen the aperture of how you think about your problem, help you identify some things you might not be thinking about. And then there's also tools that help you hone in, like prototyping, like surfacing assumptions, to really gain traction and confidence and proof points to get to the next step. It's not about solving everything, but it's about keeping that momentum to the next question, next step in your business design. With that, I'm going to wrap us up. Becca, I have one last question for you. And I always love to end with, what advice would you give to yourself earlier in your career? While you think on that, I'll just wrap us up. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. We've been speaking with Becca Carroll, who's an Executive Business Design Director at IDEO. If you liked this style of episode and want to get feedback on other projects, we would love to hear more. We will be sharing a post-webinar survey, which will be prompted, and you can take it right after you sign off from the call. If you want to dive deeper into some of the tools and mindsets that you saw today, I invite you to check out our Business Innovation Certificate. The tools that you saw, some of them are glimpses into what is taught in our certificate program. And I highly recommend, if you're looking to gain insight in how to use more tools to solve business challenges, like the ones you heard today, please check it out at ideou.com/bizcert, BIZCERT. And with that, Becca, final advice for your younger Becca self?
Tough question. Okay. This is what the advice I would give myself, and maybe it's useful to everyone in the room who's presumably a business thinker, a business person. A lot of times in business, you're sort of taught to think very linearly, to think about your career very linearly, to think about what are the things that I can do to reduce risk? What is the safest choice I could possibly make? And I actually think my advice to my younger self is like, don't think linearly. Don't try to think entirely logically about your career as being a specific ladder you have to climb. Think about it like it's a marathon through the fog, right? And so if you are curious and open to where the path is leading you and you're putting your feet in front of you, that's it. You're doing it. You're on the right track. Like, trust the race course. It's going to get you where you want to go.
Magnificent. Thank you, Becca. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.